Well, I'll be serving as chair primarily to sort of keep time. But just to frame this discussion, I'd like to quote a recent op-ed by Carol Costello at CNN, in which she references Professor Andrew Caton, who I believe is here with us right now. Costello discusses the somewhat degrading and reductive conception of Midwesterners as merely, quote, nice. She begins her article this way. I'm a friendly, hardworking Ohio native. It's how a lot of my friends in New York describe Midwesterners. It's as if we're assembled at the, quote, flyover Wonder Bread factory, devoid of color or depth. We supposedly represent all that is wholesome in America. That may be true, but friendly and hardworking is so bland. Well, I think our panelists will do much to prove that the various peoples and demographics of the Midwest are anything but bland. Jeffrey Hegleson, Assistant Professor of History at Texas State University, will examine the ways in which the Great Migration shaped the Midwest. And Gregory S. Rose, Associate Professor of Geography and Dean and Director of the Ohio State University Marion, will discuss American and European immigrant groups in the Midwest by the mid-19th century. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thanks, Joe. I'm very pleased to be here. I appreciate your forbearance in allowing a historical geographer to invade your space. But already then, having seen a lot of geography, I'm feeling more comfortable than I might have otherwise. I've got a fairly large number of maps. Basically, what I want to do is to dig into the distribution of population in more detail than what we had looked at. We're going to move through them fairly quickly to give a high-level sense. There's a lot more detail behind this, and there's a quiz at the end, so you need to be ready. Okay, so my focus is really on what was referred to as the Old Northwest. So we're really looking at the eastern half, or the east-north central region, if we want to look at it from that perspective. And it was indeed, as Joe suggested, a region of contrast. So about 4.5 million people in 1850, 2 million of whom lived in Ohio, and then only a little bit over 300,000 lived in Wisconsin. So there are some considerable regions and differences, and of course within the region you had Cincinnati, which was the 6th largest city in the United States in 1850, barely smaller than the 5th largest. So I want to focus on the 1850 census. As was mentioned earlier by Nicole, it was the first census to include birthplace information and the first comprehensive census. So it wasn't just head of household, it was everyone whose birthplace was recorded. And so this is what it looks like. If you're going to dig through the microfilms, these are the sheets that the surveyors collected as they went out. And so you'll see in column 9 is the birthplace, and actually in column 6 is the color, which was black, white, or mulatto, depending, as we'll see in a little bit. Just wanted to show you this one briefly as a reminder of the spread of settlement. So this is 18 persons per square mile. You'll notice the older areas in Ohio obviously had achieved that by the 1820s and 1830s. It's a gradual spread to the west and a little bit to the north, but not too much further north. So by the time you get not a lot further north than where we are in Michigan or in Wisconsin, those are areas that were not very heavily settled. If we start at the highest level by looking at the origins of the population, we can divide out by those born in the state in which they were found, residing in 1850, and those who are immigrants, and basically that's everybody else. So as you see from the Old Northwest, generally it was about a 50-50 split, but you also see some pretty interesting changes. So that in Ohio, about 60% born in the state, 40% born out of state. Wisconsin, as the youngest of the states, was with quite a bit different in terms of its percentage, 20% in and 80% out. So quite a difference across those. If we look very broadly at the leading birthplace region, basically what I've done then is to exclude individuals who were born in the state where they were counted. Okay, so they're out of the mix. So we're looking at everybody else, and I've divided here northern areas, midland areas, and southern areas. The north A little bit different conception than what you'd seen, but I think the data holds this up, is New England and New York. The Midland is Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and then the South is everything south of the Mason-Dixon line and south of the Ohio River. And the reason I pulled this one out is just because of the influence of Pennsylvania being so strong, especially as you see in Ohio and then partly into Indiana. If we start working into these individual areas, about 7.7% of the population of the immigrants, again, that's just who we're focused on, birthplaces in New England. And you see the pattern. It's a very interesting one. It's a very strong one. We saw little bits of it earlier. Clearly, they came across directly to the west. You see the Connecticut Western Reserve. You see the Ohio Company of Associates lands in southeastern Ohio, and a kind of a group in central Ohio as well. So we've got that group. We can look at the New Yorkers, very clearly 17%, very heavily concentrated in Michigan and in Wisconsin. You've got a number of counties in Michigan that had 50 to 60 or even more percent of the immigrants from New York, and some counties in Wisconsin that were at a fairly high percentage, 30 to 40 as well. These are the Pennsylvania birthplaces across the region, 13%, but as you see, the heavy concentration in Ohio and pieces of Indiana as well, and there are a number of counties in Ohio that had 40 to 50% of the immigrants from Pennsylvania in 1850. I'm going to jump then to the south, so I just put this one up again, same one you saw, but you realize the southern pattern there in southern Ohio, but especially Indiana and Illinois. So these are the Virginia birthplaces. On average, 7% across the region, very heavily concentrated in southern Ohio, southern Indiana, and then kind of scatter out as you get further west in Illinois. A number of counties in Ohio had 40 to 50% of their immigrants born in Virginia. If we look at Kentucky, it shifts even a little bit further to the south and west. So you see along the river in Ohio, to be expected, right across from Kentucky, but the heavy swath through Indiana and then into Illinois in terms of counties where they were above average percentage. So that's what we're looking at, over 6% in these cases. A number of counties in Indiana had 40 to 45% of their immigrants born in Kentucky. North Carolina is a pretty interesting pattern here. On a regional basis, only 2.3%. But as we begin looking at what the distribution pattern is, we see a particularly heavy concentration in Indiana. Indiana had 7% of its immigrant population born in North Carolina. As you look at the Indiana connection in particular, but also along the border with Ohio, there's a very close association between North Carolinians in Indiana and Quakers. So that was a very strong grouping that came out of the Quaker counties of North Carolina. And so you had a number of counties in Indiana that had 25% plus or minus of their immigrants from North Carolina. And then if you look at Michigan, anybody recognize that county? It's Cass County. And Cass County had a very strong population of Quakers and North Carolinians and, for that matter, African Americans. So that one sort of jumps out, but that really was an anomaly, certainly, as we look at it. I want to look just briefly at the African American population in this region in 1850. They were defined as and identified in the census as free-colored, and they included in the 1850 census for the first time a distinction between black and mulatto. Unfortunately, the census takers didn't give anybody any criteria. So it was up to the canvasser to determine, is this person black, or is this person mulatto, even though the census said that needed to be, that distinction needed to be made in very particular ways. So it was very important to the census that that distinction be made, but there were no criteria. But in any case, this is all free-colored population in 1850. One dot representing 10 individuals. There were about 45,000 African Americans in the Old Northwest in 1850. That was right around 1% of the population. And you see some heavy concentrations in a number of areas. There's Hamilton County, Cincinnati jumping out, but you've also got a number of other urban or urbanized counties there. And if you start looking, for example, in Michigan, you see Wayne County with Detroit, but you also see the southwestern corner, Cass and Berrien. You see Cook County with Chicago and a number of other areas here and there, but a real strong concentration in the southwestern part of Ohio and the east or southeastern part of Indiana. And this is just another way to look at it. This is above the average percentage, so for 1%. So in those counties, there was more than 1% of the population African American. And you get up to the far northern parts of the Lower Peninsula or northern Wisconsin, and you say, wow, there were a lot of African Americans there. No, there just wasn't much of anybody there. And so 1 or 2 African Americans would, in a percentage basis, put that population over the average. This is kind of a complex map, but it breaks it out again, northern, midland, and southern. And you'll notice how much further north the southern origin of the African American population moves to. So the African American population was considerably more southern than the general population. And the zeros are counties that had no African Americans. This looks at counties that had the largest population of African Americans having been born in Virginia. Again, it's a similar pattern to what we see, heavy concentration in Ohio, scattering other areas, and then the southwestern corner of Michigan with the African American population there. These are the North or South Carolinians, predominantly North Carolinians, and again, you see the concentration in the areas of Ohio, or of Indiana, sorry. These are the population born in Kentucky, similar kind of pattern to Kentucky generally, in that swath headed northwestward from Kentucky, but also in the northern Lower Peninsula and in the UP, again, 1 or 2 people. And then this is the New York pattern. So you clearly see that they did arrange themselves as the general population did as well. So most of the counties with African Americans born in New York as the leading one were to the north. Let's look briefly at the foreign birthplaces. On average, they made up almost 25% of the immigrant population. These are, as you might anticipate, a distribution that shows some interesting things. Indiana didn't seem to be particularly popular for foreign immigrants in this grouping here. You see them scattered in parts of Indiana and in parts of Illinois, but especially heavily in Michigan, the Lower Peninsula around the shores, and in Wisconsin. And then some urban centers again pop out. So you've got Detroit, Chicago, Cincinnati, across from St. Louis in southwestern Illinois. These are the Germans. The Germans were the largest group, 10% plus a little bit, German-born. And you see them in a heavy concentration in northwestern Ohio. You see them in the central part of the Lower Peninsula, in the Saginaw area, the Frankenmuth, those types of regions. And then you also see them in Wisconsin in the eastern shoreline, where Washington County had 58% of its immigrants were Germans. Okay, so you see that very heavy concentration there. These are the Irish, about 6%. Again, further north, relatively few in Indiana. You see some other urban centers for the Irish population. Some of them were rural, but some of them were urban. Many of them, of course, poor, having come over just as at the tail end of the potato famine, and many of them were poor and landless, and they were laborers. They worked wherever jobs were available. Here are the English, similar kind of pattern to what we've seen in other cases. You see them in a number of areas, but not so much in Indiana. And since we're here, we have to look at the Holland birthplaces. It was such a small percentage that I forgot to put it in, but it was only 0.3% across the region. Now, having said that, you recognize a couple of areas scattered around here and there. You see the population in Brown County Wisconsin there. But of course, you see the west central part of the Lower Peninsula with the population. There were just under 2,000 natives of Holland living in Michigan in 1850. Of those, 96% of them lived in Ottawa, Allegan, Kent, or Kalamazoo County, and 62% of the immigrant population in Ottawa County was from Holland. That made up 43% of the immigrants. So you see that very heavy concentration there. Here are the Canadians. They stayed north, no question about that, in terms of where they were distributed in the region. So one of the things that John asked me to talk a little bit about, and I'll do that as part of the wrap-up, was to talk about some changes. So from 1850 to 1860, that decade was to date, the heaviest immigration decade in the United States. 2.6 million people arrived in that decade, although during the 1840s there had been 1.7 million, so that was still a pretty significant number. But if we look at the trends in terms of the percent of the population born in the state, each of those states increased in that period of time. The states are getting older, they're maturing, and more children obviously born in each of those individual states. If we look at the immigrant population percentage, that went down. Of course, those are mirror images of one another. If we look at the US-born proportion of the immigrant population, these are on percentage basis, that went down as well. So the immigrant population, obviously we saw earlier, but the US percentage of the immigrant population declined in each of the states. And the foreign-born proportion went up. And you'll notice went up pretty significantly in a couple of cases. The Germans, a significant increase in the percentage of the population, of the immigrant population that Germans comprised. And you see, especially in Wisconsin, a large percentage jump. Wisconsin had 39,000 German-born citizens in 1850. It had 124,000 in 1860. So a huge increase in that population. The Irish also increased, although in Wisconsin the increase wasn't nearly as much. Well, all those Germans, percentage-wise, made a change there. But also the immigrant population increased in each state. As you look at these, Indiana's typically at the bottom because Indiana had the smallest immigrant population, 1850 or 1860. And then the English, not much of an increase proportionally in terms of English-born, but in Wisconsin, their numbers or their percentage really fell. Again, the German increase, showing that role. So as a wrap-up here, this is where we were, northern, midland, southern. You clearly see the geographic distribution. You see the impact here of transportation routes. You see the impact of land availability. You see the impact of environment. You see a number of geographic impacts that played a role in how settlers distributed themselves in the Old Northwest by 1850. It was a region of more complexity, perhaps, than we realize. Complex in terms of immigrant populations, complex in terms of where the US settlers came from, and complex as well in terms of the African American population that was present. Thank you. I'll hand over the machine.
All right, thanks. We've got the image on this screen of all the most boring states that you left from your... It's funny to look at that and talk about this. I actually find that... as we're getting my PowerPoint ready, which is going to come up in just a second, I am a product of the Midwest, not just in terms of my scholarship. I wrote my first book about Black Chicago politics between the 1930s and the 1980s. And so that book is rooted in the migration of African Americans from the South to the North and the politics that they created there. But also, I'm Helgeson, and my ancestors migrated to Sisseton, South Dakota, and my grandmother then hitchhiked from South Dakota to Alexandria, Minnesota, found her husband. And then, when John asked me to do this paper, I was thinking about all of that because I hadn't really thought of myself as a Midwestern historian. But really enjoyed sort of considering the broader implications of the Chicago story for this regional story. And you mentioned that there aren't sort of simple Midwesterners, right? I am the product of farmers, Norwegian farmers, but I'm also the product of community organizers from Minneapolis and New York City. And we did move to New York City when I was a kid, and I now live in Texas, Central Texas. And every time I leave the Midwest, I realize how Midwestern I am. Okay, I was a permanent outsider in New York, although I spent over a decade there, and I was a permanent outsider. I am a permanent outsider, I think, in Texas in a lot of ways. And so I think there is a really strong regional identity that I've been living and that I've been reflecting on as I've been talking about this. My charge today is to talk about the effects of the Great Migration on the shaping of the American Midwest. And there's quite a number of ways to talk about this huge topic. I am not going to spend a lot of time on the demographics, although in the piece that I'm writing, I have quite a bit on the demographics. Yet I'm going to save something for you to look forward to reading, right? The outlines of those demographics are relatively familiar, I think, to historians of the United States. The transformation of the most rural people in the United States at the time of World War I into the most urban group, population by the post-war period, the transformation of an almost entirely Southern, in statistical terms, population in 1910 to a population that was almost evenly divided between the North and the South by 1970. So that you create places like Chicago where 1.2 million people lived in the Chicago-Gary region by 1970. You create places like Detroit, which at the beginning of the century had just a few thousand African Americans and then approximately 50% by later on. So the demographics are important, but what I want to focus on is kind of what really captures my interest, and that is the development of the political ethos of the Black Midwest. Okay. And I noticed that one of the main questions that frames the conference is to ask how the culture and history of the Midwest, what it can teach us about the development of democracy, the expansion of industry, and the flourishing of pluralism in the United States. And I think that in order to understand that, we have to look at the ways that African American politics are embedded in, are essential to the stories of both the promises and the exclusions of American democracy, both the promises and exclusions of American industry, and both the ethos of inclusion of pluralism and the kind of the violence of group identity that goes along with pluralism. That the political ethos that develops here, I think, is very important to understanding the past of the Midwest and the future, by the way, which is something else I want to talk about. There's a tendency among historians to, when they think about the influence of the Great Migration on the United States, to focus on the achievements of artists, politicians, writers, musicians. Historian James N. Gregory manages better than anyone I've read to sum up the influences of the Black and white migrations, what he calls the Southern diaspora, on the United States. They transformed American religion, he said, spreading Baptist and Pentecostal churches and reinvigorating evangelical Protestantism. They transformed American popular culture, especially music. The Southern diaspora transformed American racial hierarchies as Black migrants in the great cities of the North developed institutions and political practices that enabled the modern civil rights movement. The Southern diaspora also helped reshape American conservatism, contributing to new forms of white working class and suburban politics. Finally, the Southern diaspora transformed the nature of American regions, Gregory says, helping with the reconstructions that turned the South into an economic and political powerhouse and collapsing what had been huge cultural differences between that region and the rest of the United States. Other historians have done similar kinds of things, looking at the way the blues, the way jazz, the way that Black writers have reshaped the American nation. And I think that those apply in particular ways to the Midwest. Who can imagine American culture without an understanding of the artists who were recorded and broadcast in Kansas City, St. Louis, Chicago, and Detroit. I bet we could spend the entire time allotted for this panel, in fact, naming our favorite musicians and arguing over who were the most influential artists. Many of us in this room could also, I'm guessing, cite our favorite Gwendolyn Brooks poem or Robert Hayden poem. Recall at least the outlines of our most memorable scenes from a Richard Wright story, or make an argument on the spot about the ways that Midwestern black writers reshaped American modernism by bringing traditions of social realist politics into American literature. I'm betting that you have a good sense of black politics in the Midwest from the post-emancipation era of attempts to try to create a kind of individualist liberal civil rights politics led by people like Ida B. Wells and integrated into crusades against lynching, to the rise and fall of black political machines, to the roles that black voters played in the making of the New Deal and the modern civil rights movement, and in bringing the movement for black power into the halls of government. I'll bet you also have an image, or at least a sense of the kind of image will pop into your heads when I mention the titles of black media outlets, ranging from the Chicago Defender and Jet and Ebony magazines to the Chicago-based Good Times 1970s television show. There's also a litany of influential activists who are based in the Midwest, whose names may be less well known among the public, but who, in the minds of historians, were at the heart of the labor and civil rights movements of the 1930s and 1940s, and the civil rights organizing of the 1940s and 1950s, as well as the black power struggles of the 1960s and 1970s. There's clearly a great deal to celebrate in the migration's influences on the Midwest. But even the kinds of heroes that emerge in these stories reveal something more complex, more ambivalent, something touched with tragedy in this Midwestern story. For it is in the tensions between freedom and oppression, opportunity and subordination, movement and segregation, resistance and accommodation that the black migration gave rise to its cultural force. In 1941, Richard Wright captured the characteristic ambiguity of this migration and its influence on the Midwest. On the plantations, he mused, our songs carried a strain of otherworldly yearning, which people called spiritual. But now our blues, jazz, swing, and boogie-woogie are the spirituals of the city pavements, our longing for freedom and opportunity, an expression of our bewilderment and a despair in a world whose meaning eludes us. The meanings of life in the Midwest eluded the black migrants like Wright for the same reasons they elude us, because the complexity of the region defies simple definitions. For black Southerners living in Detroit's Paradise Valley, Chicago's South or West Side black metropolis, Cleveland's Flats, Minneapolis's Frogtown, or in Gary, Indianapolis, Springfield, Muncie, Omaha, or Grand Rapids, for them the Midwest was simultaneously both more open and more closed than the Jim Crow South had been. And so every aspect of the migration's influences on the Midwest must be seen with an eye to the tensions between the longing for freedom and opportunity on the one hand, and the profound limits on that freedom and opportunity that always threaten to engender, as Wright put it, bewilderment and despair. Such tensions are ongoing. At the end of 2014, the Midwestern press, newspapers, and online outlets across the Midwest reflected on the year in light of the events in Ferguson, Missouri. On December 24th, 2014, for example, the Fond du Lac Reporter published a story on the racism African Americans who moved to that Wisconsin city encounter every day. While Fond du Lac may not be Ferguson, said one resident, racism is showing up in subtle and sometimes not so subtle forms. This conclusion about racism in the small town or medium-sized city Midwest and the haunting reference to corroborating events in Ferguson came from Christopher Cross, an African-American nurse who moved to the town after being discharged from the Navy. Cross revolted in disgust at the racist lawn figurines in his neighbors' yards, and he had to paint over the stenciled rows of watermelon slices and pickaninnies in the kitchen in the house that he bought. Just as concerning, he noted, there were no black business owners listed in the town's 2010 census, and educational outcomes were lower for local residents, for local black residents. And as in Wisconsin as a whole, the, quote, worst state in the nation for blacks to live in, according to one recent study, racial disparities abound in the education system, in policing, and the economy. Cross had not given up on his dreams of a more open community on the southern shore of Lake Winnebago. but his neighbors and city officials worried that things were going to get worse before they got better. Local tensions are growing as locals worry about the arrival of new black residents from cities like Milwaukee and Chicago. A new migration then from cities to suburbs and small towns across the Midwest has been creating these kinds of tensions. Stories like crosses can be found across what was once the nearly all-white hinterland of Midwestern cities, as the destinations of the 20th century migration become places to flee in an ongoing search for a better life. In this new movement of black Midwesterners, there's a new imperative to understand the dynamics of the previous century's migration. I think perhaps the best way to understand the influences of the Great Black Migration on the region is to consider what historians would want us to know about the previous movement's dynamics in order to better move through the world today. And so I want to give just some brief lessons from the past that historians have offered that I think would be useful for people living in the Midwest today, but also they get directly at the kinds of influences of the Great Migration on the Midwest. First of all, it's important to recognize that before the Great Migration, what we think of the Midwest had been envisioned in ways that were deeply divided by race. As Eric Foner has talked about, free soil, free labor rights saw the Midwest as the great hope for their white independent producers' republic. These were not even the Copperhead Democrats who would come about later. These were actually the anti-slavery figures in the Midwest. And yet, it was in Alton, Illinois, that the free white soilers took up torches and pitchforks against the abolitionist press. Still, black runaways got through, aided by a still largely hidden network of freedom allies on the Underground Railroad. When they did get through, many wisely continued on to Michigan and then into Canada, but the rapidly growing towns were heterogeneous enough to provide pockets of safety, tolerance, and even abolitionist advocacy. From the outset, the Midwest has been a place deeply divided by racial ideologies, defined by the tensions between everyday racism, punctuated by bouts of racial violence that change in their specifics but never seem to quite go away. The kinds of racial violence change in their dynamics, from anti-black riots to the kinds of riots of rage and political voicelessness that we've seen in the last 50 years. On the one hand, and yet there is an openness of institutions that has also allowed the Midwest to become such a site of important black cultural, political, and for some, economic progress. There is this image, right, of the Midwest as being one of the beneficiaries of the blessings of liberty, of avoiding the curse of slavery. This is rooted even in de Tocqueville's image as he's floating down the Ohio River, looking at the left bank of the Ohio River and seeing the kind of the curses of slavery, and looking toward Ohio and seeing the benefits of capitalism, the benefits of individualism, the benefits of entrepreneurialism. That there's been this kind of image of the Midwest as a respite from the South. I think that the stories of the Great Migration uphold that image to some extent, although they also reveal the kind of the mixed reality here. Even before the Great Migration began then, the Midwest, or in their terms, the territories north of the Ohio River, held a kind of mythical multiplicity of meanings for black Southerners. Richard Wright summarized the mixed feelings the passage across the Ohio River inspired. What emotions, fears, what a complex set of sensations we felt when, looking out of a train window at the revolving fields, we first glimpsed the sliding waters of the gleaming Ohio. What memories that river evoked in us. Memories black and gloomy, yet tinged with the bright border of a wild and desperate hope. The Ohio is more than a river. It is a symbol, a line that runs through our hearts, dividing hope from despair, just as once it bisected the nation, dividing freedom from slavery. If regions are to some extent political projects, then it is important to recognize how those who came before us saw this region as a place of real possibility amidst the limits that it engendered, in order to try to reconcile what might seem to be competing visions for opportunity in an environment that fosters freedom for all. It is also important to keep in mind that the migration was not propelled by social and economic forces alone. The migrants were present at the making of the migration. Black leaders in the Midwest and in the South helped frame the desire for the migration. In some few cases, local community leaders in the South organized entire towns to move north together. And the Chicago Defender, distributed by black Pullman porters throughout the South, sang the praises of the migration as a step toward the liberation of the race. Moreover, individual migrants helped build the momentum, becoming important links in a chain migration, either persuading relatives, friends, and acquaintances to move north, or facilitating their counterparts' self-driven flight from the South. Properly understood, the migration, the growth of the black Southern population in the Midwest, must be seen as a project of both individual and group liberation. To move was to make a deliberate decision based on personal circumstances as much as historical context, to take a chance on networks with friends and relatives, to leave behind the Jim Crow South for the unknown of the North, to risk that your dreams in the promised land would be for naught as well. We have to recognize that the region did hold on to its title as the promised land in popular imagination at the very same time that if you do oral histories with the people who moved, especially after World War II, you'll find, as one woman said in an oral history of Cincinnati, it was not the promised land at all, that those two things always coexisted. The promise and the limits cannot be separated. It's also important to recognize that this was far from the largest migration in the United States during this time, but it was the most visible. And public responses to such visible migration must seek to avoid being directed by invidious comparisons. And I think that this is a deeply important lesson for contemporary Midwestern politics. The persistence of segregation and inequality, it must also be noted, is the result not of a natural process of urban change, but of choices that individuals and institutions have made. This is the theme of the most dominant black urban literature over the last 30 years, of the making of the second ghetto after World War II, and in the making of the urban crisis in the 1970s and 1980s. What historians have shown is that there are identifiable individuals and institutions that maintain, that buttress the lines of segregation around cities like Chicago and Detroit, most famously, but not just there. I think also in places like Minneapolis that, when I was growing up in Richfield for part of my youth, people thought of as a real open kind of place. But these kinds of limits were everywhere. It is important to note, that this is in 1950, that the kind of geographic spread of the black population is still dispersed largely throughout the South and very concentrated in the North. And so we tend to associate the migration with urbanization, with the cities, the cultural association between blackness and urbanness, right, is so strong in our culture that we have a hard time divorcing ourselves from it. In fact, it's blocking us from seeing the black suburbanization that is going on around us today, being able to understand that now maybe we don't need an urban league, we need a suburban league, right? This is actually where most of the tensions are playing out today. And I think that there are many stories to be told. If you're looking for projects for graduate students or for yourself, many stories to be told about black movement into the suburbs and small towns of the Midwest. Historians have done important work on this. Look, for example, at Chagrin Falls Park, just outside of Cleveland, Ohio, where Andrew Weiss found black migrants seeking the suburban dream with normative commitments to home ownership and distance from urban problems. Imagine life in the coal mining town of Buxton, Iowa, where company officials, for reasons still to be explained, recruited a largely black workforce, consciously sustained a cooperative interracial community between 1900 and 1914. Or look at the obscure community of Frog Island, just outside of Waukegan, Illinois, north of Chicago along Lake Michigan, where black migrants in the World War I era overcame resistance from local KKK figures and other whites in order to create a community that lasted into the 1960s. Any historian of the Midwest would, of course, be skeptical of the notion that such smaller communities were in any way simple. Such relatively small but complex towns included Richard Pryor's Peoria, Illinois, which remained the subject of his comedic genius throughout his legendary and culturally radical career. And it was in Des Moines, Iowa, Driscoll, North Dakota, and the University of North Dakota that Arabelle Thompson found the drive to make it in the world of journalism in Chicago and to become Jet and Ebony magazine's African correspondent during the era of decolonization. And it was in Lorain, Ohio, as has been mentioned before, that the Nobel Prize-winning novelist Toni Morrison found inspiration for much of her work on African American culture and history. And what has been described recently as a radical literary mission to see the regular quotidian black life, the kind that doesn't sell out concert halls or sports stadiums, as complex, fantastic, and heroic, despite its devaluation. In the end, the presence of a radical Midwestern vision of pure possibility and creativity, like the one Toni Morrison has forged, must be weighed against the significance of the persistence of racial inequality and exclusion today. Yet another era of racial violence in American metropolitan regions and the underlying racial tensions in Midwestern towns where violence, thankfully, has not become manifest. The migration's influences on the Midwest leave us with three main conclusions. Racism tends to beget racism. The mutual causation of urbanization and racism, I think, needs to be considered. The absence of racial violence that has not indicated the presence of justice, and when Midwesterners have followed the better angels of their nature, they have achieved remarkable cultural, political, and social progress. I would even suggest that, given the limits of sources and the nearly limitless scope of implications of the migration, the meanings of these influences cannot be understood as linear. I think the lesson is that we need to accept that in a region with a history and present so divided and often so hidden and so torn between the tensions between opportunity and exclusion, we must seek a future that fosters possibility more than one that protects certainty. All right, thank you very much. I don't know if you need that.
Thank you to both panelists. We do have about 10 minutes for questions, so if you have any, we can open it up.
I have a question for Greg. I have two questions, actually. When you say New Yorkers in your data, is that primarily New Englanders who moved into upstate New York and then into the Midwest?
Yeah, so if I dig around as I have done, in some genealogical records or in some land transfer records, you find that the vast majority of the New Yorkers that moved to Michigan were from the upstate region. And so I feel fairly confident in terms of defining them primarily as having been New Englanders, because many of the ones who got to the upstate region were in fact New Englanders themselves.
And as far as you know, has anybody done any work on these Quaker Yankee counties in the Midwest and abolitionism? I mean, have they mapped the, say, Underground Railroad and abolitionist activity and sort of equated them with the Quaker and Yankee counties? Is there a way to do that?
Well, there's been a little bit of that. I published a paper some years ago in Indiana Magazine History that was looking at the tie between Quakers, African Americans, and North Carolinians in Indiana. And so, some of the stories, the Levi coffins, et cetera, of the world, you hear some of those things. But you're probably aware there's some very interesting literature coming out now that really is focusing on, yes, the Underground Railroad was an element, but it was probably more significant for African Americans fleeing the South that they're African American, that they found assistance in the African American community, not necessarily aligned with these traditional Underground Railroad paths, such as the ones you showed on the map there.
Cass County, Michigan, that was mentioned by you or someone.
Yeah.
It's Quaker. I wonder whether both of you would comment on whether in the 1850 census, for example, there's any way to tell about gender breakdown and differences in patterns of migration, and what you've come across in terms of the Great Migration. For example, even in Grand Rapids, we have data on Dutch single women immigrating to Grand Rapids around the turn of the century. And also, there's a book by Lisa Kristoff-Bain on women who worked as maids from the Great Migration. But what have you found in terms of gender differences? Anything?
Yeah, I haven't dug into it, but the information is there. So as you go back to those manuscript sheets, you can go back through and see whether they were family groups that were there or individuals. And so that information is there if you want to dig for it. I've also looked a little bit at some of the gender differences between the African American population and the entire population, but I'm not really ready to kind of make any significant suggestions as to what that might have looked like.
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, I'm friends with Lisa Kristoff-Boehm, and but also Darlene Clark Hines' pioneering work on all of this. I mean, so especially after in the World War II and post-war migrations, as people were migrating directly from the Deep South rather than kind of the steppe migration that was more common earlier. Often what you had were African American men going directly for the industrial jobs, and women as kind of people who sustained networks across space and time, who would be kind of key links in making the chain migration actually work. They were the kind of, early on, Jim Grossman talks a lot about kind of, these male leaders of the migration during the World War I era. Later, I think it's become clear, and it becomes increasingly clear the more you look at kind of the ground level stories of community building, which I write a lot about, that Black women were the kind of the key actors in maintaining a sense of community that was actually committed both to protection of family, protection of church, protection of neighborhood, but also as time went on became more formally political, and really did get embedded in the union movement, became embedded in the anti-machine movement in big cities, became embedded in kind of the not just quality of life. I don't mean to diminish quality of life politics, but the kind of combined quality of life politics on an everyday level with more formal political resistance and opposition. And Lisa, I think, shows the ways that women struggled to gain some of that independence because of the kind of work that they had to do as domestics. But as new kinds of work opened up over the course of the post-war period, and women were actually Black women were more bigger beneficiaries of the open of clerical work and other kinds of work. They had more independence, more ability to be able to be those kinds of leaders in formal politics. So it's a complicated story, but it is that story, and it deserves a lot more attention than it's received even still. But I just found, I didn't set out to write a book about Black women, but Black women were the ones who were making history as you looked at the neighborhoods in Black Chicago.
I was going to ask Jeffrey if you notice similarities and patterns between migration north of Blacks to cities and migration west from Europe, white folks coming into the Midwest.
Well, I think in both cases, what the social scientists describe, for example, is that they're self-selected communities. So one of the great kind of tragedies of the response to the Second Great Migration was to see them as the causes of urban problems in the post-war period. To the kind of the social disorganization literature of liberal sociologists and urban planners. Informed everything from the attempt of the kind of the framework for social work and to the way that people thought about urban renewal and slum clearance as being kind of we need to get rid of this blight on cities that was caused by the migrants. In fact, the more sophisticated census data and other kinds of demographic data have shown that the Black migrants throughout this period were more educated than the people they left behind in the South, and they were, especially in the first 10 years or so that they lived in the North, they were more successful than the people who had been born in places like Chicago and Detroit. So I think I'm not an immigration historian, but I think that kind of what I understand is that mirrors some self-selectivity among migrant populations in general, and there are some probably pretty understandable reasons why Black migrants got kind of singled out as being the ones who couldn't adjust to the city, when in fact they were adjusting to the city. What was causing the disorganization of communities, if you want to use that language, was actually the cities themselves, and the imposition of segregation and discrimination and the exploitation of wealth from Black communities.
I have a comment and also a question. My comment, I just wanted to remind everyone that we are missing Susan Gray's piece on Native Americans in the Midwest. And that at the same time that this was a place of great promise for many people, it was also a place of
Well, it's certainly running through the journalism that's being written about the Midwest these days, about kind of the increasing racial diversity in the Midwest. Those stories do include kind of the black-brown dynamic in a lot of those cities. Lila Fernandez has written about the black migration to Chicago, and I think she's trying to create a kind of and black-brown relationships in Chicago, and I think she's trying to create a historical context for what is going on today, where we can't assume that there are going to be political alliances, for example. We can't assume that people are going to see themselves as their interests being aligned, and it creates these kinds of multifaceted political tensions along lines of race, class, ethnic origin, and I think it raises, and this is one of the reasons why studying places like Lorain, Ohio, where the diversity and the seeming openness created frictions, both constructive frictions and I think that some destructive frictions, that those kinds of studies will be helpful in trying to figure out how to respond, how to think about what's going on in our contemporary world today. So it is out there, but I think it really needs a lot more work.
And Hillary.
Is there any white migration that you can tie to the Great Migration? Is there any correlation? Is there any correlation at all? Did the same occur? I know anecdotally and not scientifically that in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan during the Second World War there was some significant white migration in the timber industry.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, this is one of the great things that Jim Gregory did in his book Southern Diasporas, is actually to bring the Great White Migration into the same story as the Great Black Migration, and to describe, and in fact the White Migration was much larger in number than the Black Migration. That's surprising to people because it was less visible, because there was more return migration to the South, because people were able to disperse into a broader set of communities. They weren't as concentrated, although there were places that were, kind of the up south of Appalachia, in places like Gary on the north side of Chicago and Detroit. So those migrations are certainly happening at the same time and in tension with each other. And I think that there was a kind of old argument that was one of the main causes of kind of racial tension in the North, that white Midwesterners, white Northerners generally wanted to blame Southern migrants for racial conflict in their cities, and I think that's a stark oversimplification of the dynamics, given the kind of, the fact that, for example, Tocqueville described that there was greater racial prejudice in the upper Midwest than in the South on an individual level, before the Civil War. So I don't want to make that argument, but I do want to say that the kind of the homegrown tensions were there. On the other hand, there were also, by the 1960s, efforts to create the first rainbow coalitions in cities in the Midwest. And those rainbow coalitions included Appalachian migrants, African American migrants, Puerto Rican migrants, Mexican migrants, and the older Euro-American stock of places like Chicago. So that's a flourishing of pluralism that came out of an attempt to try to create working class rather than ethnic-based coalitions in the 60s. I think that the complexities of that deserve further study. So it's a good question, but certainly shaped all of the dynamics. They've been written about mostly comparatively rather than in ways that integrate the two stories very well.
There's a hidden migration here that we haven't yet looked at. There is a second migration of European-born, East European, primarily Southern European immigrants in the period after 1900 to the cities. Pennsylvania has approximately 16% of the Polish population of the United States in 1910 and only 10% in 1920. And they all go to Cleveland, Detroit, Gary, some to Chicago, but not so much to Chicago. I haven't looked at Chicago very much. They're also coming from And that's a mass movement
Yeah.
in the 1910s and the 1920s.
Yeah, I only know that sort of anecdotally. I lived in Ukrainian Village for some time in Chicago, and that Ukrainian Village was made up of people who had lived there for a really long time and people who had come from farther east in order to join that community. And I also lived in the Pullman neighborhood on the far south side of Chicago, which was, George Pullman's model community, surrounded by the steel areas to its east and south. To the west, almost entirely African American, but to the east and south, really complex Euro-American communities of still Italian-speaking neighbors as well as Polish-speaking neighbors. You can go get, you can go to, Polish national celebrations in East Chicago this year if you'd like to. So I definitely think that that's an important influence that we haven't.
I think it was stronger in those cities such as Detroit, which were really just being created
Uh-huh.
in the beginning of the 20th century.
Yeah.
Chicago had a more stable
Yeah.
immigrant population, but you still did get some people actually
Yeah.
from the older areas. The Slovaks moved in large numbers out of the coal fields to as far west as Belmont, Montana. But primarily to the same Midwestern areas. What's his name's novel, Out of This Furnace, the third generation of Slovaks
Yeah.
out of the coal mines, they're saying, or the steel mills, they're saying, we got to go to Detroit.
Right. Yeah. No, that's interesting.
Yes, we have time for about one more question.
One thing I'd like to ask the public about is thinking about migration as not a historical issue in the Midwest, but as a current issue in the Midwest too. One of the ways to think about the dynamism of the region is to think about Hispanic, Asian, African migration to the Midwest right now. What kind of work do you think about on that? The second point I'd like to make is out migration is equally interesting and almost as important to the development of in migration. The problem in the Midwestern states these days is that younger people are leaving on the road. So what kind of scholarship exists right now on those two topics? Contemporary migration to the Midwest and out migration.
I know it's out there. I'm not familiar with it. I don't know.
Well, I know that, so as part of when I wear my public historian hat in Chicago, we give tours of Chicago's new ethnic communities, so Hmong communities and Vietnamese, the spread of Chinatown. I don't know, I'm not sort of up on the social scientific literature on those migrations, largely because I'm not still getting my PhD, so I've fallen behind. But I think it's certainly something that people are paying attention to. The second question I know much more about, which the Great Migration of African Americans into American cities coincided with the second migration of whites out of the city, and it's one of the main reasons that kind of structured metropolitan politics from the post-war period until today. The kind of the classic arguments are about the way that it declined the tax base. It created kind of this divide politically between the suburbs and the city. And it structured, for example, everything William Stuntz talks about, the way that it structures the criminal justice system, because you're voting at a county level for prosecutors and judges who are going to be and you're also voting at a county level to how you're going to fund police forces often, at least in part, and that affects. So the people who are voting are actually not living in the communities that are being most directly affected by that. So I think that dual migration of African Americans into the cities and whites out of the cities, and that dynamic of why they left is very much more complex than just white flight. There is some really interesting work that's been done on the complex interactions between whites and African Americans during those moments of transition in neighborhoods that weren't all about violence and hatred and flight, that were actually constructive efforts to try to sustain interracial communities. And so that's a definitive migration that coincides. And then since the 1970s and 1980s, net migration has been out of Midwestern cities on part of African Americans. They've been moving to Atlanta, Charlotte, Houston, other places, LA, Oakland, San Francisco, not so much San Francisco anymore, but so that out-migration is deeply affecting the old black metropolis communities, because that's also a self-selected migration of most likely the people who get college educations are the most likely to leave, which says a lot about kind of the troubles of trying to create and sustain a community in a segregated, Chicago is as segregated or more segregated today than it was in 1970. So it creates real problems for trying to create and sustain a workable community in that kind of situation.
And actually, I got my time wrong. We have about 3 more minutes, so if there are any other questions.
Since Susan Gray didn't make it, I'd like to ask Gregory Rose to comment on how Native Americans show up in the 1850 census.
Yeah, basically they don't. That's the short of it. So Indians not taxed were not included in the census. And so Indians taxed meant Indians who were living outside of reserved areas. So if you were not taxed, then you were living in a reserved area, and that you weren't counted. Yeah, and so you do run across some pretty interesting things running through the manuscript. Census, as I did, there's no accommodation for an individual who might be Native American living in Cincinnati or wherever they might be. So were they white? Were they black? Were they mulatto? There's no designation for them, although if you dig around in those records as much as I have, you will discover in some places that somebody put an R in the color column, and sometimes you'll see an Indian name next to that. So they aren't identifiable. The first census of Native Americans in that era was 1853. So it was a little bit out, but it's not included in the census numbers to any significant degree.
Let's have another round of applause for our panelists.
Thank you.